David, I'm in the Trump 100 studio. You're at Washington National Cathedral, yeah? The funeral of Lindsey Graham.
Yes, I suppose, James, it's been a day of two wars and one funeral. The funeral of the long-serving senator for South Carolina, but in attendance, two world leaders who are at war, Benjamin Netanyahu and Volodymyr Zelenskyy. So lots of symbolism here, but the significant business was done earlier at the White House, where you were, James.
That's right, David. Of course, Netanyahu and Zelenskyy in town to pay tribute to an old friend. Lindsey Graham was very much a player, a Washington player on their behalf, big advocate for Israel and for Ukraine through the years. In fact, the day before he died, he was in Kyiv meeting Zelenskyy, talking all things Russian war and talking about sanctions against Russia. That would have been one of the subjects up for discussion between Zelenskyy and Trump inside the Oval Office. And I tell you, David, I'm struck by a contrast with that meeting. Remember Suitgate, when Zelenskyy was ambushed by Trump. Why aren't you wearing a suit? It's a different dynamic now. Zelenskyy he projects power more. He's had military success. And I think Trump, a man ever inclined to back a winner, respects that. He's also more vulnerable as a president who has been seen to fail to a degree, less perhaps powerful than he was that first time round.
And Zelenskyy appeared to suggest afterwards that the meeting had gone well, that they had explored the potential for America licensing Ukraine to produce Patriot defence missiles, and also explored the potential for fresh diplomatic efforts. That's not something we've heard in relation to Ukraine for quite some time, James.
Yeah, assertive, confident. I thought Zelenskyy, when he emerged from that meeting, went straight to a separate meeting with the executives of Lockheed Martin, the American weapons manufacturers. And that was a key element of their discussions, this business of Patriot missiles that they want to defend themselves against Russian weapons. You'll remember, David, that it was a matter of years ago now, there was a promise, half promise from Trump of Patriots to Ukraine. They were never delivered ultimately. It's been repeated this time around. Time will tell how concrete the promise is this time round.
Yeah, you talked about that meeting almost 18 months ago, that jaw-dropping moment of showdown between Trump and Zelenskyy. That was broadcast all over the world because the world's media was in attendance. That wasn't the case today. It was closed press. How unusual is that, James?
Relatively unusual for Donald Trump, certainly. He is a man who likes an audience and has things to say. That does change when the territory is rather more tricky. And tricky it was for the meeting with Zelenskyy, but also, of course, for the meeting with Netanyahu. Tension laced through that get-together. These are two individuals, old allies, but the alliance is fractured. It certainly has been since the Iran conflict was kicked off. Bearing in mind that there are many in Washington, D.C. pointing the finger at Netanyahu, saying that this is a man who suckered the United States into conflict with Iran, that he played Donald Trump. So I think that's the very territory that Trump would not want interrogated on in the company of Netanyahu before the world's journalists. Much to discuss with Netanyahu, apart from anything else, their divergent views on what happens next with Iran. Netanyahu, he wants military escalation. Trump, who does a good impression of a US president stuck in neutral, he wants out and fully realises that to escalate militarily, well, that impacts on him at home. Higher prices, more political fallout threatened in the run-up to the midterms and so on.
So a bit of a revolving door at the Oval Office. I think Zelenskyy had only left a couple of minutes when Netanyahu arrived. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt later said both meetings had been positive and productive. And then the focus shifted here to the National Cathedral for a moment of reflection, we might say, looking back on the life of Lindsey Graham after a morning of contemplation with the two leaders in town, keen to hear what President Trump was thinking about the respective wars in Ukraine and Iran.
Yeah, as Donald Trump and the various VIPs took their seats in Washington National Cathedral, I suppose the context, the mood music was the reports of the Netanyahu meeting. They were limited in terms of the content, but it would have been I imagine, a robust exchange, but one in which they would have been determined to preserve the friendship. Certainly Netanyahu would have been. He's a man with elections in his home country later this year. There is political capital in the endorsement of Donald Trump. He wouldn't have wanted any fracture lines to extend and to threaten that, for all their disagreements, not just on the course of the Iran conflict, but also on wider matters, the nuclear deal with the Saudis, which left Netanyahu's nose out of joint. They are not the allies and partners that they once were, that's for sure.
No secret that Bibi Netanyahu desperately seeks Trump's endorsement ahead of elections in Israel later this year. He hasn't got it yet, but the attention then shifted here. Of course, Lindsey Graham had been on a fascinating journey with Donald Trump. He went from being one of his most vocal critics to being one of his most vocal allies, and he was a man who in many ways represented America's foreign policy of intervention. His support for Ukraine was unwavering, his support for Israel was unwavering, and that's why the two leaders had made the journey to Washington to attend his funeral. And it is not every funeral that is addressed by the President of the United States.
Vice President Vance, members of the Cabinet, members of the House and Senate, distinguished guests, Darlene, and the entire Graham family. I love you all. Today we gather in the deepest gratitude and profoundest sorrow to honor a beloved friend, a devoted brother, a respected statesman, a giant of the United States Senate, and a true American original who left us much too soon. And that can only be the one and only Lindsey Graham.
Yeah, I watched it in the office on the monitor, David, and it was fascinating just to the spectacle for one thing, but also, the individuals. Donald Trump, front row on the edge of the bench. I was struck by the singing of How Great Thou Art, sung by the whole congregation, not by Donald Trump. Intermittently, he seemed to, join in with the odd phrase or two, but, that was a president of the United States in the front row, not participating. You don't often see something like that at big occasions with people of that stature. There are rules for the media often in occasions like that where you're not actually allowed to point the camera at them. So people singing, not singing. So you don't often see that on the TV.
You don't, James, but the congregation of several thousand here at the National Cathedral did get to see it and did get to hear it. A very personal tribute from the President of the United States. He tended to veer away from the politics. That's unusual for him, apart from describing Lindsey Graham at one stage as extremely hawkish.
No matter how heated things got in Washington, virtually everyone, Republican or Democrat, liked Lindsey. Well, not everybody, but it sounds good. Not everybody. He was a tough cookie, okay? I have to veer from this for a second. He was a tough cookie, Darlene, but he was beautiful. But he was also ready with a joke and a gleam in his eye. After being lectured on the excruciating details of patent law by a fellow senator during a flight, Lindsey declared that he had discovered a new form of enhanced interrogation and torture for the Guantanamo Bay area. He said this is really bad stuff and boring. And while he was an incredibly hard worker, he was not exactly an early riser, as many of you know. When Senator Tim Scott, a great gentleman in his own right, I can tell you, invited him to prayer breakfast at 8:30 a.m., Lindsey told him, Tim, if Jesus himself comes back before 10 a.m., I ain't going. Yet, while he was always quick to laugh, and no one ever doubted the gravity of his mission, above all, Lindsey Graham believed in a strong America. He wanted a strong America. He had unwavering faith in the righteousness of American power and prayer. And he was extremely hawkish. I will tell you, he never saw a war that he didn't like. Only his true friends would understand that.
Yeah, I saw the Washington Post were reporting that the death of Lindsey Graham has made President Trump think about his own mortality. It's something he's been discussing with close members of his team in recent days, but certainly a day to pay tribute. And clearly sentiments, I think, from an old friend. You know, they had their exchanges and it was a challenging relationship in the beginning, but there was warmth, I think, from Donald Trump for Lindsey Graham.
And there was a moment of atonement from Donald Trump when he said he had done something he shouldn't have done when he and Lindsey Graham were political opponents, and he published Lindsey Graham's telephone number online.
He was a force of nature, and I will miss him greatly. As you remember, Lindsey and I did not exactly get off to the best of starts, running against each other. Back in 2016, Lindsey said something rather nasty on his flight to becoming the next president of the United States. So naturally, I did something that I shouldn't have done. I shared his personal cell phone number with the millions of people that happened to be watching that particular day as I made a speech, a very important speech. And I remember the number 202-228-0292 if anybody wants to give it a shot.
He repeated that number today and then said people should give it a call if they want to. But it will be remembered as an extraordinary day when the coffin of a long-serving senator was at the centre of the cathedral, geopolitics in the pews, and the President of the United States in the pulpit of all places, a president who still has big decisions to make about wars in Ukraine and Iran.
A suitable send-off from the boss.
Yeah, a send-off that is continuing, so I better go back and listen to the hymns and the readings and any other tributes there are, James.
Enjoy, David. See you soon.
Bye-bye.